the fact of the matter is that we don't have strategic clarity, or at least consistent strategic clarity, on how it's the Russians that are in fact the belligerents and the saboteurs of trying to wrap up this war. That is a success. I mean, that is a fruit of this process. And the Russians often have the initiative on the framing of these issues. I mean, whenever it seems like we're on the cusp of a major U.S. policy breakthrough, be it do we send them in tomahawks, as we were debating late last year, we seem to be on the cusp of that. Vladimir Putin calls up Trump, not more than 24 hours ahead of his fateful meeting with Zelensky, and it gets sabotaged. Or on the cusp of there seeming to be a breakthrough between Trump and Zelensky when they meet in Florida, right as rain, Vladimir Putin calls less than 24 hours ahead of their meeting, and the meeting is sabotaged, right? And that's a big problem. And here's the funny thing is that I think the sequencing and the phasing of these negotiations and who agrees to what terms is very important, because here's typically what happens. A package of conditions are presented to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians basically say yes to 90% of them. We can negotiate these other ones that are not acceptable to us, but basically okay. And then it goes to the Russians, and the Russians say no. But for some reason, whenever the Russians say no, they manage to say, but it's the Ukrainians' fault, and we're not able to do that. And I think it's very important that instead of positing these things to the Ukrainians first, it's important to posit these things to the Russians and have the Russians own the impetus and own it for saying no. Because the Russian positions are actually, they're pretty consistently saying no to these things all the time. But by having the Ukrainians say, actually, no, yes, 90%, no to 10%, we have to doctor it. The Russians then say, well, if the Ukrainians hadn't doctored it, it would have been fine. But in reality, it never would have been fine because, while the provisions do actually benefit Russia quite a bit, it's not 100% of what they would like strategically. For example, the Russians decisively reject any idea of there being a European country putting peacekeepers or assurance forces or under whatever rubric you want to call them in Ukraine. That's like a categorical hard line for them. And it's of course absolutely necessary for any sort of stable and condition for this war. But the Russians are rejecting it all the time. And I wish, and for some reason it's not fully stuck with all the policymakers, that actually any sort of end game that we have that is built around that planning assumption, there will be a European or American support contingent in some variety operating in Western or Central Ukraine. The Russians aren't going to accept that. So, the way that the Russians are able to lead the conversation, frame the Ukrainians as the bad guys here, obfuscate their own rejection of what is the sensible negotiation position that all the parties agree to, it's really astounding. And it's a testament really to how sophisticated the Russians are at this stuff, because despite a weak economy, despite not being able to conventionally seize this military territory with conventional means, they can still run laps around us diplomatically and really play a much weaker hand, but to get very, very nice returns.
Indeed, and as you say, George, this war is carrying on regardless of whatever level of talks are going on. I want to talk a bit more about the battle on the ground, specifically Pokrovsk. ISW maps, reflect the situation that we're all pretty well aware of now. That Myrnograd and Pokrovsk are essentially still on the cusp of falling. They show significant Russian infiltration now into central Myrnograd. Do we know if the Russians were able to achieve their objectives there of holding that road to the extent that they can use it as part of an effort to trap significant numbers of Ukrainian troops and materiel there?
Yep, it's a good question. So, quick point on the methodology of the map. The map simply is a reflection of our ISW's assessment based off of the most recent evidence that we've observed in the open source. And so what we've seen many times is when one of these crucial roads or supply lines into the Pokrovsk-Myrnograd pocket is seized, or the Russians are sitting on top of it for a moment, sometimes it will reverse a day later, 2 days later, and then we'll collect evidence that the Ukrainians are on top of it. and then so we'll reverse it and we'll change it. So when you look at the map at any given time, it's sort of a snapshot of our best efforts to assess the situation given the available evidence, and it changes. Um, and so, it's not permanent in all instances. I'd also note that working with open sources, there's a time delay. The combat footage that we observe that gets posted today, on January 19th or January 20th, oftentimes that is stuff that was filmed back, a week ago on January 15th or something. But it's only been posted today. So there is a time delay, and it's not always 100% real time. But to answer your question very directly, it's our assessment that based off of the current open sources, that the Ukrainians still are operating in some limited capacities in the vicinity of or in Myrhorod and Pokrovsk. They're not entirely seized and pacified yet. I suspect it's like Russian clearing operations to dislodge and remove the few remaining Ukrainians that are there. The Russians are going to seize these towns. It's just a question of time. The Russian claims that they seized them back in I forget if they claimed them in November, if it was December, but they claimed them in late 2025. Those were certainly premature, as was the claimed seizure of Kupiansk. But it's very difficult to say to what extent, the Ukrainians are entirely cut off or surrounded. Because here's the thing, those roads are not very useful as logistic lines in any event at this point, because the Russians are reconnoitering them with drones and striking them. And in fact, back starting in June, July of 2025, we're already systematically denying the use of these roads as logistics highways to sustain them, and forcing the Ukrainians to use smaller, lower tier roads, or even no roads, and really just sort of off-roading it and hoofing it. And at this critical late stage of the campaigns to seize these towns, I suspect the roads aren't safe. And so whether or not the Russians manage to put their red advance or their infiltration over a particular segment of road, like any Ukrainian that's going to exfiltrate or get out of there, they're not using the roads. They were not going to be using the roads in any event. And they're probably going to have to, use some suboptimal terrain, that sort of thing. So, they'll seize this stuff, but this campaign is coming towards an end here. Now, and crucially, sort of what is the so what? I think it's important for us to talk about the so what. The so what is going to be the Russians, when they do finally seize this terrain, it's not going to facilitate a breakthrough. We're not going to see the operational unhinging of Ukraine's defense in Donetsk. This is not going to open the gates to swinging around, right, on any sort of rapid timeline. So the catastrophic, collapse of the front is not a thing. We will continue to see the Russians then reconstitute their forces, regroup. They'll have the ability to redeploy roughly the 2 combined arms army worth of combat power here to go focus on other objectives that they have in the region. Or they might simply keep pushing forward and keep slogging forward. And I expect that we will, and we can talk about this and as we continue our conversations in this coming months, and you can grade me on a curve and see how we do. But our forecast is there's going to just be more grinding positional warfare. And a lot of the hype that I think the Russians built up around these 2 towns is going to dissipate, because it's just going to be more of that positional grinding warfare. So, of course, it's a loss for the Ukrainians. It's a degradation of Ukraine's ability to continue defending Donetsk, but it's not apocalyptic by any stretch of the imagination.
And that grinding advance, is that reflected across the rest of the front, really? I mean, we know there are some advances going on in the Zaporizhzhia region, and there's that attempt, the Russians say they're trying to create that buffer zone in the north. Presumably this is much the same across a lot of the front.
Across the majority of the front, yes. There are some sectors of the front, however, where the Russians have been able to advance more rapidly. Let me put that into context. More rapidly in terms of it's faster there than it is for the rest of the front, but still very slow for the norms of modern mechanized maneuver warfare. The sector in particular where the Russians have made the most alarming gains, and that I am personally, this is sort of the sector of the front that keeps me up at night, is exactly that. The Zaporizhzhia Dnipro front, sort of the seam between Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk, and that sort of south eastern corner of the theater, where over the last 6 months the Russians managed to make again, for modern warfare, very slow, but comparatively for Russia's war in Ukraine, comparatively fast gains from around the Velika Novosilka area towards into southern Dnipro Oblast and towards Huliapole, where they're fighting now. Um, that was alarming, and it seems to be blunted for now. The Ukrainians seem to have established better lines, and they're leveraging the fact that the Russians currently are sitting on the banks of some rivers, which are forming the natural boundaries. But there was a weak spot there, and the Russians pushed. They found little resistance, and they reinforced that effort. So they moved faster there, and that's a bad thing. But the rest of the front, certainly, it's a grinding, slow advance. Um, and ideally the Ukrainians will keep it that way. And again, not just attrit the Russians forever for the sake of attriting them and giving them what they're looking for eventually, but ideally attriting them, hollowing them out in order to support a future Ukrainian campaign to retake some ground. What I'd love to see is what the Ukrainians did in Kupiansk, right? Because the story of Kupiansk was essentially Russians lean into it, they attack, they seize terrain. Situation doesn't look great on a map for a long time, but the Russians push themselves too far. The Ukrainians, over the course of many, many months, degrade the Russians, and then with an operational level undertaking, attack into them, retake some terrain, retake some territory, capitalize on the investment of degrading and attriting and eroding them. And that's, of course, contingent on good Ukrainian units, which is a function of good Ukrainian leadership, which is what we had in the Hartia Brigade that undertook that operation near Kupiansk, but also good in terms of their provisioning. And the part that we can help affect is the provisioning. And I must say, I'm very frustrated that the Western states have not been provisioning Ukraine adequately.
As we know, Ukrainian and American negotiators are talking today at Davos. There's certainly nothing on the ground, is there, that suggests the Russians think that peace is anywhere near?
That's been our assessment for a long time. So we're following the negotiations very closely. The meetings are underway. Be very interested to study and see what progress comes out of the processes to be determined, I suppose. But I'm not holding my breath. Look, I think the Russians are wasting everyone's time here. I think the Russian calculus has not changed. I think that Putin is basically happy with the current status of the war. um, his underlying theory of victory has not changed, and Putin needs to come home with some form of a win. I mean, it will be an absolute humiliation for him if he doesn't get all of the four regions that the Russians have declared, or at a bare minimum, at least the rest of Donetsk. And so I think they're going to lean into the war fighting for that terrain. Now the question is can Putin actually sustain that effort? Because to seize all of Donetsk, and there's been a lot of disinformation about this as well. I mean, just George Galloway back in December was saying how the Russians would be in Kiev by Christmas, or Orthodox Christmas, which is January 7th, because the lines are moving very quickly. But it's going to take the Russians at least until 2027 to seize the rest of Donetsk on an optimistic timeline. It could take them much longer than that. And I just don't know if the Russian force generation and economy can sustain the current tempo of operations until 2027. I think they probably can, but Putin would prefer not to, because the longer he has to sustain the war, the more the costs compound, and the more he has to lean into less butter, more guns, and that's really not. I think it's something that he can do, but it's something he'd much prefer not to do.